Hello, I'm Reverend Matthew J. Watts, Senior Pastor and Teacher of the Grace Bible Church in Charleston, West Virginia. I'd like to thank the United States Office of Civil Rights West Virginia Advisory Committee for extending me this opportunity to share my thoughts regarding the excessive discipline and the disproportionate suspension and expulsion of African American children and low-income children from West Virginia's public schools. Over 6 years ago, University of Pennsylvania issued a report where they examined the discipline and suspension of minority students in the 13 southern states. And they found in that examination that African Americans were disproportionately suspended from school at much higher rates than their non-African American colleagues. West Virginia was included in that study. Mr. Ryan Quinn, education reporter with the Charleston Gazette-Mail newspaper, did an extensive article on the University of Pennsylvania's report, and he interviewed representatives for the Kanawha County School Board, as well as the Washington State School Board and Superintendent's Office. And they concurred that the University of Pennsylvania's report was accurate in its reporting that West Virginia had a disproportionate rate of suspension among African American children versus non-African Americans, with African Americans being suspended at twice the rate of whites. This issue of great concern to someone like myself. I refer to this phenomenon, this disproportionate suspension and expulsion of African American children from public schools in West Virginia, as a silent, underlying condition that's unrecognized and that is unaddressed. It contributes to truancy because suspension days are unexcused absences. It contributes to the educational achievement gap because these children are missing academic instruction. It is the issue that brings kids into the juvenile justice system. It's an issue that also contributes to children often dropping out of school. And a recent study suggests that school suspension is the first step from the school to the prison yard pipeline. That's why I refer to it as the underlying condition, unrecognized and unaddressed, that's contributing to much of the social pathology in poor communities. What's troubling about the state of West Virginia, that even though this issue has been known to exist since 1968 with a study, and then again in 1976 with the second study, yet the state has done nothing to address the issue. In 2015, we approached the state school superintendent in West Virginia, and he agreed to discuss this matter with us, but took 2 years to give us the data. In 2017, we convened a summit to have this issue addressed. A second one in 2018, approached the state school board, the state legislature again, and nothing has happened as a result of those various meetings. Therefore, it is time for us to seriously examine why is it that the state school board and state school superintendent's office refuses to address this issue. We're hopeful that the work of the West Virginia Advisory Committee will bring attention to this issue and hopefully get it addressed in the near future. Thank you. I'm Reverend Matthew J. Watts, Senior Pastor and Teacher of the Grace Bible Church on the west side of Charleston, West Virginia. I also serve as the President and CEO of Hope Community Development Corporation, a nonprofit organization. I would like to thank the United States Office of Civil Rights West Virginia Advisory Committee for inviting me to provide an opening statement regarding my concerns over the excessive discipline and the disproportionate suspension and expulsion of minority children from schools in the state of West Virginia. I refer to this phenomenon of the excessive discipline and disproportionate suspension and expulsion of minority children as the silent, underlying condition, unrecognized and unnoticed. It is an issue that is creating many problems for African Americans in the state of West Virginia. In fact, excessive discipline and suspension contributes to the education achievement gap as children are missing so much academic instruction. Secondly, it contributes to truancy because the unexcused days count toward truancy, and truancy is the #1 status offense that brings youth into the juvenile justice system. Thirdly, it can result in them moving toward criminal activity as juveniles and end up being incarcerated as a juvenile. It contributes to them dropping out of school because they're falling so far behind. And there's recent reports that suggest that school suspension is the first step from the school to the prison yard pipeline. Therefore, it is my opinion that school suspension may be at the root of systemic generational poverty in the state of West Virginia, as between 6,000 to 18,000 children in West Virginia are suspended from school each year. The overwhelming majority of them are low-income white children, and African-American children are disproportionately suspended. This has had a cumulative effect over the years of thousands of young people, tens of thousands, being suspended from school. It's my opinion that the achievement gap has resulted in many young people being undereducated, and it's been compiled over many years. Therefore, it contributes to them being stuck at the lower rung of the socioeconomic ladder without the educational level of the skills to get livable wage jobs. Therefore, poverty is perpetuated in these communities. That is why I refer to it as the silent, underlined, unrecognized, unaddressed social condition that's contributing to the achievement gap, truancy, school dropouts, delinquency, and ultimately the school to the prison pipeline. What's disturbing about the state of West Virginia is that this phenomenon has been uncovered as early as 1968 with the report and a second investigation in 1976, yet no steps were taken to address it. Most recently, in 2015, the University of Pennsylvania's report, where they looked at the 13 southern states, and they uncovered that in these states, they had some of the highest suspension rates in the country, and they also have some of the highest adult incarceration rates in the nation. Again, that's why I refer to this as the underlying, unaddressed, unrecognized social condition that's contributing to many negative outcomes, including the perpetuation of poverty. It's alarming and disturbing to me that even though the state of West Virginia has been very well aware of this problem, at least in 2015 with the University of Pennsylvania's report, where representatives from the Kanawha County School Board and Superintendent's Office and from the state superintendent's office were questioned and gave statements to a reporter, Ryan Quinn, with the Gazette-Mail, indicating that the University of Pennsylvania's report was accurate in its reported of West Virginia suspension statistics. What's even more disturbing is even though we've had meetings, the Charleston branch NAACP as well as the state NAACP, with superintendents to discuss this matter in 2015 with Dr. Michael Martorano, 2017 with Dr. Steve Payne, them giving a commitment to address it, but never following up on any action. In 2019, we brought this matter to the attention of the West Virginia legislature, and even though they indicated a willingness to address it, they chose not to do so. In 2020, we come back to the legislature, and after Senator Patricia Rucker indicated she would put forth a bill that has some substance to it, she later withdrew that option and instead introduced a bill that merely required the state superintendent's office to look at the data for 2 more years and report back in 2 years, which would be this January's legislative session. We're hopeful that the West Virginia Advisory Committee's hearing and their report would bring this matter to the attention of the public, and that the public will demand that the West Virginia legislature and the West Virginia State School Board and Superintendent's Office put forth a plan to address this onerous, silent, underlying condition, the excessive and disproportionate discipline and suspension of African American and low-income children from West Virginia's public schools. Thank you. This is Reverend Matthew J. Watts, Senior Pastor and Teacher of the Grace Bible Church in Charleston, West Virginia. And if you've heard me preach or heard me speak, you often hear me speak very affectionately and very endearing about my beloved hometown of Mount Hope, West Virginia, and how it was such a nurturing, comforting place when I was a child growing up in the late 50s and the early 60s in that wonderful community. Unfortunately, it's not the community that I knew as a kid, but it still has tremendous meaning to me, and I love that place and the people that live there dearly. So some people wonder, why is it that you're doing a documentary or want to do a documentary about the Triangle District and you're not even from Charleston, West Virginia? That's a good question. It's because I'm not from here, but I chose to make this my home over 43 years ago. And because I know the importance of place, because of Mount Hope, West Virginia, and the dear place that place holds in my heart. And so when I began to understand what had happened to the downtown Triangle District, this large, predominantly African American community in Charleston, West Virginia, it really moved me, because the thing that came to my mind: how would I feel if Mount Hope, West Virginia was to be demolished? Or better yet, what impact would it have had on me had I witnessed the demolition of that community myself when I was a young boy or a teenager? And that's what happened in the downtown Triangle District in the late 60s and the early 70s. I moved to Charleston, West Virginia to live in 1978. But my first encounter with the city actually was the summer of 1976. And I was here as a young engineering intern student between my junior and senior years in college, working for the Union Carbide Corporation. One of the things that really impacted me, and I was somewhat befuddled over the issue, and that was the anger that appeared to be in so many African American people here in Charleston in 1976. It reminded me of Washington, D.C., that I spent the summer of 1968 after the death of Martin Luther King in April of 68, the death of Robert Kennedy in June of 68, and then I was there after all the riots and all the social upheaval and uprising that occurred. I knew why African Americans there were angry. I did not know the African Americans here why they were so angry. So I didn't ask anyone, didn't feel like I knew anyone well enough to do that. Then when I came back in 1978, it seemed to have dissipated for what it was in 76, but I always felt like there was something beneath the surface. There was some issue that was beneath the surface in Charleston, some rub between blacks and the city establishment of this town, but I never quite knew what it was. And then every now and then I would hear an African American person talk about the Triangle District, that used to exist. But I was really surprised they never went into a lot of detail about what had happened. They just would make reference to the Triangle. But then several years later, the late Mr. John Randall and the late Miss Anna Gilmer, they partnered together and they created a book of the history of African Americans in Charleston, particularly in Kanawha County in general. It's a fascinating document with biographies and with narratives about places and institutions, biographies about people. And within that, there is a page and a half, less than 2-page narrative about the Triangle District. In a marvelous economy of words, Ms. Anna Gilmer summarized the history of the Triangle District from its establishment in around 1900 or so to its demolition in the late 60s and early 70s. And I was just kind of amazed and fascinated that something had happened that devastating, that traumatic, and that there was so little discussion about it. And so I just started to be a little more tentative and have my antennas up, a little bit more focused. Every time I would hear the Triangle mentioned, I still was surprised at how little black people talked about it. And so then I started to talk about it to African Americans and was amazed at how many African Americans that were close friends of mine that had actually lived in the Triangle, that was there, that had witnessed the bulldozers coming through and the houses being demolished, that had witnessed the marches and the demonstrations and the protests and the amazing resistance that was put up by the residents there and the pastors and the community leaders and the social justice champions. I was amazed that I had developed these close friendships over this 40-plus year period I'd been here, yet I had never heard them really articulate how they felt about the Triangle. So then I said to a couple of my close friends, I believe that the experience of the Triangle, that it traumatized you. I believe that it traumatized you, and I believe that it traumatized the masses of blacks that lived there, and even those who did not live there, but was associated with it. And I said, I think that you guys are still living with the grief from that trauma, that you never really had a collective grieving of it, discussion about it, putting it in a proper perspective, and saying, how do we maintain the history of it, the triangle, the spirit of the triangle, but recognizing that we will never be able to regain it. And the more I talked to individuals from here, the more people I found that had lived in the triangle. And some of them had anger, they had sadness, some were still grieving. But as I would talk to them, they would light up when I would ask them the question, tell me about your fond memories of the triangle. So that is what motivated me to try to be a part of an effort to put together a documentary to document the history of the triangle, its champions, its institutions, its rich culture, so that it could be memorialized for this generation and for future generations. The triangle will never be rebuilt. And the way it was dismantled and demolished, it was unfair. It was unjust. It was probably really unnecessary. But it became a victim and a casualty of Charleston's business elite and those who had a commitment to progress without any regard to the rich culture and the rich history of the people that had lived there. It is ironic that one of the main reasons that the triangle was demolished was to create this economic renaissance in downtown Charleston, and that the centerpiece for this economic renaissance will be the Town Center Mall. And so in recent years, many of you will know that the Town Center malls have gone through its problems of bankruptcy and passing through the receivership and through the hands of several people. And yes, millions of dollars have been made, a lot of jobs have been created, but it becomes a symbol, really, of the failure of the supposed urban renewal efforts to create this renaissance in downtown Charleston at the expense of churches, of a culture, of families, of a people who had never known any life other than the triangle. So we can't get it back. We can make sure that the story is told. And my humble attempt with my friend Nathan Togger, who also shares in this vision, is to provide a venue for some of the residents who live there to tell the story in their own words, with their own passion, their own emotions, their own feelings of what the triangle was, what it meant to them, what they feel like they lost when it was dismantled and demolished, but how they hope that the spirit of the triangle will never die, and that by us memorializing it and documenting it on this documentary, the successive generations will realize that African Americans were part of building a great community. They built great institutions, and the triangle and its people contribute mightily to development and the growth of Charleston over the years. And they also paid a great price and sacrificed for the progress of Charleston to move forward. May the Triangle District, may the Triangle champions always be remembered. I hope you will enjoy this documentary. It's just our humble attempt to give space and give a venue for those who live the Triangle experience to tell their stories. Thank you. The epic novel COVID-19 pandemic has created some unprecedented challenges for our nation and for our state. Every institution in our society has been stretched. Not merely the medical health system has been overstressed, our economy has been overstressed, the churches have been overstressed, and that they have been were closed down, many of them for over a year, and some churches still have not reopened since the pandemic hit back in March of 2020. And some have closed permanently and never will reopen. Our educational system has been overstressed. As our schools' academic system were disrupted like no other time in history. With every epic crisis, with every novel challenge, it also creates unprecedented opportunities. such is the case with COVID-19. Without COVID-19, there would not have been a CARES Act that brought over $1.25 billion into the state of West Virginia. Without COVID-19, there would not have been an American Rescue Plan Legislation Act. I believe that's brought in over $4 billion into the state of West Virginia. Without COVID-19, we probably would not be on the verge of having a better bill that will bring billions probably into our state, certainly hundreds of millions. And there may have not been the infrastructure bill. There may have not been the political will and bipartisanship for the politicians to come together on the infrastructure package. But both parties recognize the need for an economic stimulus in that particular area. So our state, the state of West Virginia, one of the poorest states in the union, one of the states that has many, many challenges, and that we are ranked near the bottom, if not at the bottom, in many social indicators, whether it be education, whether it be health, whether it be poverty, whether it be quality of life, and whether it be life expectancy. We rank near the bottom. But the monies that come to our state as a result of COVID-19 provides an incredible opportunity. The question is, will we have the wisdom, and will we have the will, and the willingness to do the right thing? Let's look at a couple of these opportunities. The CARES Act brought in $1.25 billion into the state of West Virginia. And that money was really placed in the hands or under the trusteeship of Governor James Justice with some very broad guidelines from the federal government. At the end of the day, the governor had pretty much unilateral authority to allocate those funds as he saw fit, which he chose to do. Now, what some of us had suggested, namely the Tuesday Morning Group, we had suggested that the governor set aside 20% of the CARES Act monies, which would equate to $250 million, and designate those monies to be used to address poverty in the 220 census tracts that have poverty rates of 20% or higher. That decision was made because in 2018, with the tax reform legislation that President Trump spearheaded, that created something called opportunity zones. And in the opportunity zones, they designated up to 25% of census tracts in each state to be opportunity zones if they had poverty rates 20% or higher. So that's why we had the 20% threshold. So our request was set aside 20% of the money to target census tracts that poverty rates 20% or higher, and the dollars were to be allocated in 2020. Thus, the Economic Justice and Equity Fund that we call the 2020 Economic Justice and Equity Fund. We think this would create a tremendous opportunity, right, to invest strategically at the census tract level, project to promote job training, employment, economic development, and other projects that would help the people that lived in those places. So now we are nearly 2 years later, and the governor still has $126 million, which he has not designated how it would be spent. So that's 5% of the original amount that was allocated of the, well, it's 10%. 10% of the original $1.25 billion. And we still are making the same request. And now we would add a little bit of specificity. Why not target the 220 census tracts that have poverty rates 20% or higher, and that means that each census tract will get about $500,000, and specifically designate the money to be used to create more safe, affordable, energy-efficient housing in these communities, because we have one of the highest home ownership rates in the nation. We have some of the poorest quality of housing in the nation. And so that would could serve as a job training, an employment, an economic development driver, and would create improved housing in these communities. In fact, there's actually a piece of legislation that was passed in 2009, Senate Bill 2950, the Neighborhood Housing Economic Stabilization legislation, which is in Section 31 of the West Virginia State Code, could be used to provide the legislative framework and the mechanism to designate this $126 million to target the census tracts with poverty rates 20% or higher, to designate that $500,000 or so in each census tract to create housing. That's one thing that could and that certainly should be done. Let's look at what has happened, the opportunities created in education. Under the American Recovery Act, the state of West Virginia received $800 million that went to the West Virginia Department of Education. And that money was to be allocated to the 55 local boards of education. And it was allocated based on the percentage of the state student population that reside in each county. So for example, Kanawha County has a little over 10% of all students in public schools in the state of West Virginia go to school in Kanawha County. So Kanawha County has been allocated $82 million from the American Recovery Act funds that's come to the state of West Virginia. Now that's a significant amount of money. That's about a third of the Kanawha County school system's $220 million that they have each year. And so what I'm suggesting, and what the Tuesday Morning Group is suggesting, is that some of these funds should be allocated to support the work of local community-based organizations that run after-school tutoring, mentoring, and academic enrichment programs, and that run summer tutoring, mentoring, and academic enrichment programs, that give these groups resources to help them to augment and to supplement what the kids are receiving in the public school system. These monies belong to the people, and they should be invested, some of these monies should be invested strategically at the local community level to build the capacity of the local community-based organizations to support youth to try to improve their academic performance. And you would say, well, Reverend Watts, why do you think that's so important? Well, I'm glad you would ask that question, because from birth to the 19th birthday, children spend 9% of their time at school and 91% of their time somewhere other than school. That's correct. You get your calculator and you do the calculation. The 991 principle. Child spends 9% of their time at school, 91% of their time somewhere other than school, from birth until age 19. And once they start the school, they spend roughly 17% of their time at school and 83% of their time somewhere other than school. And that's why there needs to be money invested in the efforts of local community groups to help stabilize, to strengthen families, and to provide support for children after school, weekends, and during the summer, where they need the support the most. So you have these monies that come to our state, the CARES Act funding and the American Recovery Act funds. And what I'm suggesting is some of these funds should be used to support efforts at the local community level to create more safe, affordable, energy-efficient housing, to provide more structured education, recreation, academic enrichment programs for youth at the community level. And then thirdly, some of these monies should be used to build the local community's capacity to improve community and population's health at the community level. West Virginia has one of the nation's lowest life expectancy. A recent report suggests that West Virginia has the most unhealthy people in the United States of America. And we don't have a real plan to improve the population's health or to improve the health of the community. And so at some point, we got to recognize that and start investing dollars to try to help to build the capacity of local communities. And that's why it's so important to address poverty. West Virginia does not have a plan. It does not have a strategy. It has not formulated a coherent, strategic initiative to address poverty in this state. A few months ago, I Googled Western University's curriculum. I cannot find a single major or minor at Western University or Marshall University or any other higher education institutions, a single major or a minor that one could get in how to address greed and addressing poverty. So if we have 20%, close to 20% of our people in poverty, 1 out of every 5 persons that's in poverty, we're one of the poorest states in the union, yet we don't have a strategy to address poverty, then how will we ever ameliorate it? How will we ever reduce poverty? It's not going to happen by accident or by circumstance. It will require intentionality. It will require a strategy. It will require strategic investments in the people and in the place where those people live. It must be a place-based approach, and it also must be people-focused. The CARES Act funding, the American Recovery Act funding, and maybe some of this additional monies that may come to the state, whether it be infrastructure or Build Back Better, will provide the unprecedented amount of resources to develop, implement, and execute plans to address poverty, to strengthen and to stabilize families, to improve the educational skill levels of students, literacy and numeracy, by investing strategically in local community-led initiatives to help build the capacities of those communities where they can provide support for children and their families during the 80% of the time where children are not in school but are somewhere other than school. These are sane and sensible things that really should be considered if we're really going to move West Virginia forward. And so I'm hoping that there will be people that will pay attention during this legislative session, put pressure on their legislators, encouraging them to put pressure on the governor's office to use these CARES Act funds wisely. The American Recovery Act funding, it's primarily a significant amount of those dollars are actually at the county and at the city municipality level. So we must advocate with city officials and county officials to try to get those funds to be strategically invested in the people, in the places where their people live, so that we can even strengthen and stabilize families, improve community and population's health, improve the skill levels of our children so that they are moving toward having an education that will allow them to be lifelong learners and to be gainfully employed in meaningful work, that they will be able to provide for themselves and their family in a meaningful way. Thank you for your time to share some of these thoughts. Have a great day.